Hello everyone. Again, welcome back. I hope you had a good coffee. And now our next speaker for the day is Clement Pasteur. He is a CTO at Theodore UK, and he is a French engineer who moved to London 4 years ago. He is passionate about creating applications of quality at speed, making sure he can be involved in every aspect of development by adopting a DevOps mindset. So, welcome, Clemens. How are you?
Hi, I'm really good, thank you. I'm really, really happy to be joining you and being able to share a bit of my knowledge on React and everything I've learned. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. And the stage is over to you,
thank
Clement.
you.
Hello everyone. I'm super happy to be with you today and share a bit of my knowledge on on React, and especially today I wanted to share with you what I've learned about performance and more specifically Web Vitals. So before we jump into Web Vitals, a bit of background. Um, Performance has always been something that we think of as, if my app is super performant, then my users are going to be super productive. So there's a nice article that's been written a while ago, in actually 1982, where they already were measuring the impact of the response time of a system, and realizing that the lower it is, the better it is, then the more productivity you will have for your users, the more time you will have saved for your users on your application. And I thought that's a good way to introduce, okay, this was one of the aspects of performance, and even today it still is. But there's another one. And the other one, interestingly, is visibility. And you may be asking yourself, visibility, performance, what's the link? Well, you may know that thanks to this great study by Systrix earlier this year, Google is now the number one search system that we use. And if you search something on Google, people tend to click on the first links. We can see that almost 30% of the people click on the first one. You may be asking, yeah, but still, what's the link with performance? Well, earlier this year, in May, Google have decided that performance, or more user experience, is becoming a super interesting aspect for ranking the websites on the search system. So it makes things even trickier now, because before we had already a few things to make sure that the SEO was good for our website to be presented on Google, but now they have added new things that are directly contributing to the user experience, that are called the core web vitals. And this is what I want to dig into today, because performance is becoming something critical that we need to make sure we are measuring and improving on our applications, and our React applications in particular, regularly. Before we jump into that, just a quick intro. I'm Clement. I'm the CTO of Theodore, a lean software consultancy. We're based in a few countries, but I'm here in London. And I'll be happy to chat with you afterwards. Don't hesitate to get in touch on social medias or in direct chat. I'll be happy to chat with you. So, Web Vitals, what are those? Well, before we talk about Web Vitals, I think an interesting concept is that performance is really hard to measure, super hard. And we can't just say, this is one metric and this is my performance, and there we go, we need to be below that. Performance is really relative. It really depends on what the user feels. It really depends on what they're using. So there are a lot of different factors. And I think Google have done something quite interesting recently. They have split that into 3 different parts of what can affect the user experience on the website, on the system. And those 3 parts are: how much do I feel loading happening on the application, how easy it is to interact with it, and how fast is it, And finally, how stable is it? Are things moving around, or am I able to click and touch wherever I want to touch? And those three things, they consider that they are the main things that can affect your user experience on a website. And so they have decided to introduce three metrics to measure those three things: the LCP, the largest contentful paint, the FID, the first input delay, and the CLS, the cumulative layout shift. So I'll dig a bit more into each of those just after, but just as a quick summary, it's the idea of LCP shows what is the biggest thing that appears on my website, because as a user, yes, there will be a lot of different things popping up, and maybe the background image is going to appear really early, but actually the main thing that our brain is going to pick up is the biggest thing on the page. So it's important that as a developer, as someone building an app, I need to make sure that the largest thing appearing on the page appears quite quickly. For instance, as a user, I am in a cart. I need to see the price and the elements in my cart appearing quite quickly so that I've got a good experience. Secondly, the first input delay. Here is the idea of when, as a user, I start interacting with the website, if the answer of the website is more than 100 milliseconds, then our brain starts picking up that there's something wrong and it feels slow. And finally, the layout shifts. There could be multiple layout shifts on a single page, and trying to accumulate all of that. And this is the idea of how much is the website moving around. You've probably seen that on a few websites already. How much is the banner at the top popping up, the image popping up at one place? And the more the page is moving, the more our brain is confused and is affecting our experience on the website. So let's dig a bit more into each of those. The LCP, I took this image from the web dev website, which is really nice to explain. Basically, we have a lot of different things appearing on the website, but the LCP will be the biggest thing at the end on my page. So here we've got the LCP is getting updated as the page gets loaded. At the beginning is the visual stories, then the big text, and then at the end is the picture. So in this case, if I want to optimize for LCP, I need to make sure I optimize for the pictures, because this will be the biggest thing that I see at the end on my page. So I need to make sure it appears quite quickly. Secondly, the FID. Here we need to understand a bit more how the browser works, and the fact that if I've got a React app, I'm going to have some JavaScript, a bundle running some JS code in my browser. And if some tasks in my browser take a while to answer, then it means that as a user, if I interact with the website at the same time that something else is happening, then the browser is not going to be able to treat my demand. And it means that the thread is going to be blocked and the input is going to be handled too late. So it's important to optimize that, to make sure that all the tasks happening in my website are actually quite short, so that if a user starts interacting, keyboard, mouse, press, whatever it is, then the answer can be in less than 100 milliseconds. And finally, the CLS, the layout shifts. I thought the best way to show what a layout shift is by showing a video, and in this case it's, as a user, I'm trying to order something, but at the moment I'm ordering, something pops up, and there's a layout shift happening in this case, and we can see the impact it can have on the user. Even in this case, it's even worse because we can't go back and cancel the order. And so this is the concept of all the things that are moving on the page and that can affect the user experience. And they're trying to measure that by adding all those things together and giving them a measure so that it stays below 0.1. And so those three measures are called the core web vitals. There are a lot of web vitals to measure how your website is going. For instance, we've seen the first contentful paint that is different than the largest contentful paint. But they consider that those three are the main ones to make sure that you create a good user experience for your users. Now, what about React? How do I use those web vitals and make sure that my React app is performant and my users have a great user experience? Well, I had a bit of fun, and I created an app myself, starting from create React app, and I thought, okay, let's add a few things. Let's add a banner that is getting information from the network. Let's change a bit the image. Let's change a bit the text and do things around. And this is how we put a video. How when I load my page, this is how it looks like. So we can see the text appearing, then the image, and finally the banner at the top. And even if it looks quite simple, quite normal, it's like a good website and we can interact with it, actually there are a lot of different bad things happening in terms of performance, and especially in terms of those three elements, those three core web vitals. So now the next step is, how do I know what's wrong and where do I start if I've got an application that may behave badly? I don't know about it, but it may be. So how do I do that? The first step is by looking at Lighthouse. Lighthouse, again, is a Google product that's been created, I think, 2 years ago, which is trying to really measure all the different things that a website could have wrong, could do wrong, basically. And in this case, I've run it on my app, and we can see that most of it is okay, apart from performance. So I am definitely doing something wrong. And in this case, we can see some measures are in red, and I've got information that I'm doing something wrong, which is cool. But it's not enough. If I scroll a bit more on the page, I can see a few tips on how to improve that, but it's not enough because I don't know exactly where is my problem coming from on my page, because we can see even the trace that it's showing me just the text and not the rest of the image. So what next? Well, if I want to really debug what's happening on my page, we have to use the DevTools. So in the Chrome DevTools, you may have seen there's a performance tab that's used more and more and getting improved on debugging our React applications. And it's really cool because if I run this performance test or this performance monitoring on my page, I can then get all the web vitals information. So the trick here is to start from a about blank page. So we can see on the left I've got a blank page, and then I start recording, and then I go on my page and I simulate as a user. I go on my page and I see what's happening. And here, what's cool, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different measures, and we can configure it really deeply. But the interesting parts are those three things, the three core web vitals. So we can see DLCP, the largest contentful pane, when is it appearing? And I even have the images of when it's appearing, what is happening on my website when it's appearing. The cumulative layout shift. Here we can see this on the line experience. I have actually 3 layout shifts happening, and it's really cool because then I can try and pinpoint in the flow when did it happen, what was the issue. And finally, the FID at the bottom. So here it's not exactly the first input delay that is displayed, it's the total blocking time. But it's a proxy measure that is also really good. Basically, it's the idea that if the goal is to have the first input delay in less than 100 milliseconds. So what they're going to do with the total blocking time is measure all the tasks that are running for more than 50 milliseconds. Because if, as a user, I start pressing on something, the worst case scenario, I pressed as soon as another task starts, and then the task that is processing my input is running after, which means I'm going to have the first one of 50 milliseconds, then the one processing, and the maximum is going to be 100 milliseconds. So everything that is above 50 milliseconds is going to be added to this blocking time total. So let's dig into each of those and try and debug, okay, what's happening on my app and how do I fix that? Let's start with the LCP. So to understand what is the LCP, we can see here from the timeline that it's quite obvious what's happening. But if I want even more information, I can just put my mouse on it, on the LCP logo, and I can see in the app highlighted directly. This is the element that is the largest contentful pane, the largest contentful element on my page, which means now, okay, I understand this is the biggest thing they're going to see, and I can start optimizing it. Maybe it's the size of the picture, maybe it's something else, whatever it is. But I think it's interesting because in this case it's quite obvious because the picture is quite big and we know that this is the biggest thing on the page. But in some websites, actually things are quite the same size, and the measure is going to be measured differently based on based on your website. So it's interesting to look at the dev tools to understand what is considered the LCP. Next, the FID. So I mentioned the concept of the total blocking time, and the closer it is to 0, the better it is. And how do I understand what's happening in my app? Why is it so high? Well, if we zoom on, if you remember, we talked about the main thread and the idea that we need to make sure tasks on the main thread are smaller than 50 milliseconds. And here we can see there's one task that is actually taking a while. It's taking 500 milliseconds. And it even shows us it's supposed to be gray, the task, but we can see how much it is overrunning above 50 milliseconds. And then the next step for me is to go down this performance, this flame graph, and understand, okay, what is being called here. I've got a hook happening, and I can debug in my code. Okay, this part of the code is taking longer, and I can start optimizing it to make sure it's less blocking. And finally, the layout shifts. Well, in this case, we can see that I've got 3 layout shifts, 3 small ones, but are still impactful. And same as for the LCP, I can just put my mouse on it, and it highlights directly in the app. This is the thing that moved. So that I can understand this thing moved, so it means that it's been loaded a bit later, so I need to make sure that I've got the space for it before the thing is loaded, so that it doesn't shift and it doesn't move around. That's interesting. So that's one of them. The second one I've got is actually the image itself, because it's coming later and it's shifting the whole page. And the third one is actually the whole page, because I'm doing a network call that's getting some information and then showing the banner once I've done the network call, then it is shifting the whole thing around. And here, one of the ways to solve that would be to actually block the banner, because I know the size it's going to be. So I'm not going to dig too much into how I solve all of those, because I think they can be quite specific to what your application will be, what your application uses, what is the code you're using, how do you load your images and all of that, and I think it can be quite specific. But in my case, I've done a few fixes. So like you saw, the banner was showing a bit too late, so I'm blocking the size of the banner even if I don't have the network call being finished. Then the image was a bit too big, so I'm changing the size of the image because I didn't need something that's high resolution. And finally, I spotted a JavaScript code that was a bit hefty, and optimized it so that it doesn't block too much. So after doing all those fixes, this is what my app looks like now. If I reload it, the image appears directly, the text doesn't move, the banner is already there, and the text appears later, but the banner size is already there, which means that the experience for the user is way better because things are not moving around. And if I interact quickly, I can get an answer directly. And if I do another performance test, just to see if actually I improved it, we can see that yes, it improved. First, the LCP is appearing just after the FCP. So the largest is just after the first, which is a good sign. It means that the largest element is appearing really, really quickly. The experience line, which was showing all the layout shifts, had completely disappeared, which shows that there's no layout shift happening, which is really nice. And finally, the total blocking time is now to 0 because I managed to optimize those tasks happening to not have them run all at once. So that's cool. That's how you debug an app and you try and understand where are your problems coming from and fixing them one by one. But then the next step is, how do you stay on top of that? Because you could tell yourself, well, I'm going to do that every time I do a feature, or we're going to have one person that's going to check on the website every day and run all those performance tests and debug. But actually, that's a lot of work. So we need to make sure we stay on top of it in a automated way. So the first thing I want to mention is not the best solution, but I think it's something that's quite easy to install and it gives you some really great information, is the Web Vitals extension. I don't know if it's only Chrome, I need to check that, but if you install it, you have directly on the top right a small light that is either green or red. And if you pass all the core Web Vitals, you're green. If not, it goes red and it gives you the information of which one is going wrong. And as a dev, if you're developing and you're adding some stuff around, it's really cool to have that because you can have a one check directly of, okay, this is green, this is still green, this is still green. Oh, it goes red. Cool. I can now try and refresh the page to make sure it wasn't just a flake, and debug what's happening. That's a cool thing to install. I really recommend you to install it to have information of all the websites. But then the second thing is, all the tests we've done so far, they're called tests in the lab, because you're testing as a developer on a local environment, or you're testing on your production maybe, but still this is you. This is not a real user. And when the information of what your real users have is called in the field, and this is way more interesting, because maybe you'll realize that your users have different browsers that are behaving differently, maybe they've got different resolutions, maybe they've got different network connections, whatever it is. It's interesting to understand what your users are doing. So how do we get this in the field information? Well, the first thing you could do, if your website is quite public and quite famous, looking at page speed insights is a really good start, because basically what it does is gather all the data of users of Chrome that have accepted to send this information and put that in a database somewhere. So for instance, I've run it on the React.js website, and as you can see, we get the field data on the last 28 days of all the users who've been on it, and we can see that it passes the Core Web Vitals assessment, which means that more than 75% of people are okay on the first input delay, the largest contentful page, and the cumulative layout shift, which is a really good sign. It means that all your users most of your users are okay. But you can see how different it can be from the lab data, because they also run a Lighthouse test on top of it, which is, like we said, different from the field, which is a lab test. But it shows us that here the tests are pretty bad. So either it shows that the lab test has been done with a really slow network, and maybe your users don't have any slow network, or maybe it actually shows that the field data you get is not realistic, and it doesn't show the users who have bad network because they haven't activated it, or maybe they're using a different browser. So it's a good start, but it's not perfect. The next step actually is basically to implement it yourself. And that's probably the one I'd recommend for everyone. Is there's a cool library called Web Vitals, which is an NPM package. You can just install it really easily on your React app, and then decide, cool, I'm gonna add an effect and say every time this page loads, I want to gather my 3 core Web Vitals. And once you've gathered them, you can just send them to your analytics. And you can decide yourself, okay, I'm gonna track every time an LCP is bigger than this value, every time CLS is bigger than that, and start measuring that in analytics, so that you can react if you start having too many of those. And if I've tried using it, for instance, on my app, and what does it look like? Instead of sending it to analytics, I'm just logging them in my console, and we can see this is what it looks like. So the CLS, for instance, here tells me there are 3 entries, so those were the 3 layout shifts that were happening on my app. And then I can add some logic of, okay, if I've got more than 1 layout shift, I can add it to my analytic on that. And this is the same for the FID. We get the information of how long it took to answer the user interaction. And finally, the LCP, the same, how much it took to render the element. And if it's bigger than something, then you can decide to track it. Yeah. And finally, this is cool, I guess, when you're in production and you do your test on your real users, but you also want to make sure that you're not introducing anything new. And the best way to do that is just by adding something in your own CI to make sure that every time you code a new page, you code something new in your React app, you're not doing a really silly mistake and you didn't realize. So a good proxy to do that, even if it's not field data, it's still going to be lab data, because if you do it in your CI, it means you have to run your application locally. But the Lighthouse CI is a really easy thing to configure and to install on your GitHub, for instance. And it's going to track every time you do a push, you do a merge request, whatever it is, create a dashboard giving you the information of this is how the performance is affected. And you can even say, okay, if it goes below this value, I'm gonna prevent it to merge. So you can make sure you fix those before you merge to production and send that to your users. And finally, you may have seen, it's been in the past few years now, we're hearing more and more on the Jamstack, and there are technologies like Gatsby or Next.js, which are really improving how we do React, and trying to leveraging, for instance, the server-side rendering to make sure that the performance of our application and the user experience, it's even better. And I want to mention that quite quickly because I believe that today, if you start a React app, I think you should really consider using Next, because performance is becoming so critical. This is going to leverage a lot of all those best practices already. So if you start with the boilerplate of Next.js, you realize that you already have those functions being created, and you can use them directly because they will track automatically all the web vitals, and you can decide what you do with them. Either you send them to your own analytics or you do something else with them. And on top of that, you don't only get the web vitals, the classic ones, you also get the Next.js specific ones. Because this using all this server-side rendering, there are different new elements that are happening, and you may want to track those as well, because they will, if your app grows, you want to see how this evolves, which is really cool. But finally, I also want to mention, I think this is quite recent, in the past few weeks, Versal, who's the company who has created Next.js, have been creating a new dashboard where basically if you host your application on Versal, you don't have to, you can also just use their dashboard and have the application hosted somewhere else. But if you add the right config of Next.js, then it automatically measures those information on all the pages you've got, which is really nice. It means in just a few clicks, you can have this information directly from your app. And on top of that, it tries to create some kind of a global score, which is called a real experience score. And they explain how they measure it and what are the weights they add on those three, on all the measures that you can use to compare with all the different websites on the web. But also what's cool is you can see the update of this measure. And depending, also link it to the commit you've done and the releases you've done, which means that every time you see it go down, you can link it directly to the commit you've done and try and react directly, which is really cool. So if we look back at everything we talked about, just to give a bit of a summary, I think if you have a React application, or if you're starting one and you never heard of performance before or how to measure it, I'd really recommend to start with Lighthouse. It's super easy to use. Either you use the hosted version, or you actually do it directly from your DevTools. Now, if you go in the tab Lighthouse of the Chrome DevTools, you can have the same interface there. You can configure it yourself, run a few tests, and directly get measures of, okay, am I doing something wrong on my local environment? And based on that, if you have some metrics that are red, then switch directly to the Performance tab, rerun the same test, refresh the page, measure the performance, and start analyzing like we did. Okay, what is the LCP? When is it happening? Okay, I can optimize that and have something better. What are the layout shifts happening? And making sure that you prepare the space for those elements, and what are the tasks that are taking too long, and start investigating how you can optimize those. And once you do that, you're going to see those measures improving, and it's a great feeling. And I'd recommend everyone to install this Chrome Web Vitals extension, because I think it's quite easy to install and to have this light at the top telling you, oh, it's becoming red, you may be doing something wrong. Cool, you can now analyze and make sure that that you're creating a good experience for your users. But finally, don't just rely on the lab, because the lab is what you do, is what your laptop is doing. But you have to also think of what your users are actually experiencing, and you really need to start measuring these field metrics. So either it's using a hosted service like the one that Next has, or it's implementing it yourself with this npm package and sending it to your analytics to measure that. I hope that you've learned something. I was really excited to share that with you. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions or to chat with you afterwards. If you if you want to chat, don't hesitate to send me a message on any social media. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was insightful talk, Clement, I must say. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge about Web
Yeah, thank
Vitals.
you.
I have few questions.
Sure.
So the first one is, if I have never looked at Web Vitals before,
Mhm.
where do I start? And it's a React app, so how should I start?
Yeah,
That's the question.
it's an interesting one. I think I was trying to show it during the presentation, but it's quite tricky because Web Vitals have existed now for, I think, for a while, for a few years. I guess if you have an application that either already exists or you're planning to create one, probably the first step is mapping a bit the website and knowing, okay, what are the different pages that I'm going to have on my website, and where can my user arrive on the pages? And then once you know that and you have a visual mapping, maybe it could be a diagram of all those pages. Maybe what you can do is add the extension that I mentioned and start going through all those pages one by one and seeing, okay, do I get a red light popping up? And start noting down all those ones so that you can start have a list of those are the things I can start improving. And then the next step is probably running a Lighthouse test on those. So you can a proper analysis in the lab of of what is happening on those pages. And if indeed there's something you can improve, then digging into the performance tab and really trying to repeat the process and seeing what are the things that are happening on my page when as a user I arrive, which components are appearing when, etc., and start breaking down those pages.
Sure. Thank you
Yeah,
for
and
that.
once you fix that, then it's probably the next step is measuring more the users and how they do it. Because like I said, it's different in the lab and in the field. So even if you fix it in the lab, you may not fix it in the field.
Cool. So the next one we have is, does it have any metric about how bigger the impact is than others, like other tools?
Mm, I guess maybe the question is about the three core web vitals
Yeah, yeah.
and which one is probably the biggest. This one is a hard one because I think we don't really know what Google do with those metrics. It's a bit of a black box, and they don't tell us how they weight the information. So it's hard one to know. But from looking at the, I think on Versal, they show a bit of information of the weights they use for their performance analysis. And I believe that the one they weight the most is the LCP, the largest contentful pane, because they believe that's the biggest impact on the page. So I would say if you really have to start with one, it's probably the one I would start with, because this is the biggest thing that appears on the page when you load. So it's the thing that can have the biggest impact. So I would start looking at that. But then there's also, I don't have the diagram here, but there's a graph showing how the measure is done, because there are three different parts for each metric: the green, which means you're okay, the orange, and then the red. And I would focus on the measure that can really make you shift from one zone to the other. Because if you have a measure that is really red, so you say, oh, I want to focus on that a lot, but actually all the effort you're doing is just keeping it in the red, it's not going to have such a big impact. So you have to focus on the one where you really believe you can make it shift from red to orange or maybe red to green, because this is where the biggest impact is going to have.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. We have the next one. What is the impact of measuring a dev versus prod build of a Create React app using Performance tab in Chrome? This is asked by Diogo.
Yeah, it has an impact, definitely, because in React, for instance, we have all those dev tools that are loaded in the bundle.js, which means that the page is going to take a bit more time to be loaded. So this is why, again, it's called in the lab. And if you do it in the dev environment, it's going to feel slower than it can be if a user uses the prod bundle. So indeed, it can have an impact, but it gives you a good idea of, okay, maybe there's something wrong.
Sure. Thank you. And the next one we have is by Luca, saying, as far as I understood, the web vitals are all about the first render of your app. Is there a way to measure also following renders of our React app?
It's an interesting one as well. So Web Vitals is not only the first render of the page, it's of the app, it's the render of the page, which means that in the app, if you have different pages, it's going to trigger a new metrics every time you switch pages. But it's really going to focus on what you see in the page and not the rest of the page. So it could be that you load the first part of the page and it loads fast, but actually when you scroll down, there could be other stuff that are appearing that can be worse. And I don't think of a good way to measure that apart from scrolling down and maybe refresh again so that it loads on this part and you can see what is happening on this part of the page. But yeah, I think that the best way to really use those tools is see what your users are doing and measure that in the field. And based on what your users are doing, where they appear on the page, what they do by switching pages, then you track those measures. And if they're red, then you start understanding why.
Thank you. I think we don't have any more questions. And if you have any, you can later reach out to Clemens. Yes.
Yeah,
Chat or in the sessions that we have as a break. And thank you so much, Clement. It was a really insightful talk. Thank you so much.
thank you. Really enjoyed sharing that. Thank you, everyone.
We actually have a couple of more questions. Sorry to bring up. So if you want, you can go ahead with discussion. I just pass it to you here.
Yes, I just saw it. Okay. So the next question is, I tried running a test on Chrome browser by the Lighthouse, but my app is under authentication. It has a full page login mask, and I have noticed it measures only this page performances. What is the correct way to measure authenticated pages performances? Through Web Vitals library directly inside the React project, maybe? Maybe the question is just to measure the performances of authenticated pages via Web Vitals.
No, it is a good point because I think there's not that I'm aware, there's no way to configure Lighthouse to say enter those logins behind and then do your test. So yeah, the only way I would see doing that is either using the dev tools because your environment is already logged in and you can refresh the page and see those measures, or it's using directly the Web Vitals library, like you mentioned, so you can have those measures popping up.
Then there's a next one. If you use placeholders, for example, for images or widgets, can they affect LCP? And the following question is also, can you automate a performance test?
So placeholders, I think, is a good practice indeed, because it will, if it's well done, it means that the page is going to first show an image that is a lookalike, and then the proper image is going to appear afterwards, which means that there's not going to be any layout shift, and actually the biggest image appearing at the end. I think the measure is going to be impacted because it's still going to believe that the biggest element in a page is appearing quite late, but because there's no layout shift and there's an image that is quite lookalike, it's going to have a good impact on our users. So it could be a bit of a bias here where the measure looks red, but actually it's okay because the page is not moving so much. So even if the measures are a good way for you to see things that could be wrong, sometimes you have to interpret them manually and assume that, okay, in this case, it's fine, I'm not touching it.
Okay, cool. Thank you. There's also a following up question asking that, can you integrate these metrics in something like Munin?
Just going back on the question before, I didn't answer automate a performance test.
Yeah.
I think the way to automate it is a good question. I can't think so. You can do that in a CI, which means that you, with Lighthouse CI, you build your application and you run the Lighthouse test on it, which is a way. Or you can just rely on your users to do those automatic tests for you and send back your metrics. But then on the next question about Munin, I'm not aware of what Munin is, to be completely honest. So I'm not sure.
Cool.
But I assume that all those metrics, you can track them with the Web Vitals package, and then you can send them wherever you want. So it can be Google Analytics or whatever tool you have internally.
Sure. Thank you. And that we have one more question, probably maybe the last one.
Yeah.
Are there some best practices in order to correctly fix the things reported by Web Vitals test? What is the way to do it? This is asked by Luca.
I don't believe there are some best practices from what I've seen on all the projects I've done. It's always a different thing happening in the code because we haven't loaded something beforehand, because we haven't split the bundle, because the image is too big, because the code is not asynchronous. And it's, the only way I've seen to do it is by actually trying to debug it yourself and looking at this performance tab and looking at things one by one to fix them.
Cool. I think any more questions? I think there's no questions. Thank you, Clement, once again. Thank you for all the insights that you gave.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.